In the dimly lit corridors of forgotten history, there are files that were never meant to see daylight. Stories deliberately erased or rewritten to protect fragile alliances and the reputations of empires. World War II, the most documented conflict in human history, still carries shadows that resist illumination. Between the smoke of battle reports and the rhetoric of victory speeches lie sealed dossiers, missing logs, and testimonies silenced by fear. They point to convoys that vanished in frozen seas, airfields that were built and destroyed without leaving a trace, massacres that swallowed victims beyond their acknowledged toll, and secret pacts signed beneath the public facade of Allied unity. These stories are not legend, nor the product of imagination. They surface in fragments, buried in Soviet archives, Gestapo files, and CIA vaults stamped with the warning, not to be released. They are whispered in intercepted transmissions, in erased entries of military diaries, and in the sudden disappearances of those who knew too much. The truth does not always rest in the graves of soldiers or the ruins of bombed cities. It lingers in questions unanswered, in evidence concealed, and in silence carefully maintained. As we reopen these forbidden files, we confront a chilling possibility: that the greatest secrets of the Second World War were not the weapons tested, nor the leaders assassinated, but the truths deliberately hidden from history itself. What we uncover tonight are 4 such mysteries, erased from record, denied in public, yet still echoing across time, demanding to be heard. Chapter 1: The Vanishing Convoy of Murmansk. On the 27th of June 1942, Convoy PQ-17 departed Hvalfjordur, Iceland, bound for the Soviet port of Murmansk. The convoy consisted of 35 merchant vessels escorted by 6 destroyers, 4 corvettes, and 2 anti-aircraft ships, carrying a lifeline of supplies for the Soviet Union under the Lend-Lease program. Official history recalls that, after receiving intelligence reports of the German battleship Tirpitz setting sail from Trondheim, the Admiralty ordered the convoy to scatter, leaving the merchants exposed to U-boat and Luftwaffe attack. Of the 35 ships, only 11 reached their destination, but buried in declassified fragments of Admiralty file 402-43 lies evidence that the official account conceals a more disturbing truth. 20 vessels did not simply fall victim to German torpedoes or bombs. They vanished into the Arctic fog, leaving neither wreckage nor survivors. Surviving logs from the destroyer HMS Keppel describe the night of July 4th, when thick mist rolled across the convoy near Jan Mayen. Radio silence was ordered. Hours later, multiple ships reported shadowing by vessels bearing British identification codes, yet their silhouettes and markings did not match any known Royal Navy classes. A distress transmission from the freighter SS Carlton declared, "Escorted by friendlies, request confirmation." That was the last signal received before the ship disappeared entirely. No oil slicks, debris or bodies were later found. The Germans, despite their aggressive pursuit, logged contact with only 15 ships, a figure that does not align with the official losses of the convoy. The remaining vessels simply ceased to exist. In 1963, Soviet military archivists compiled a report titled "Anomalous Gaps in Lend-Lease Transfers," found in Moscow's Central Archive of the Ministry of Defense. Within it lay references to a dispersed column of 20 units, fate unknown, recorded between Barents and Kara Seas. Marginal notes by Colonel P. Mikhailov indicate an attempt to cross-reference the missing tonnage, with deliveries recorded at Murmansk. But the figures remained inconsistent. Curiously, some Soviet manifests acknowledged receipt of materials from PQ-17, far exceeding the cargo known to have reached port. The question arises, where did these additional supplies originate, if not from the ships officially declared sunk? Survivor testimony adds another layer of unease. In a 1951 interview, Merchant Navy sailor John Cartwright described how his vessel, the SS Navarino, maintained visual on 3 cargo ships as the convoy scattered. He swore that all 3 followed what appeared to be British destroyers into the mist. None was seen again. Cartwright's testimony, dismissed by British authorities at the time, aligns disturbingly with the intercepted Enigma decrypts archived under Ultra Intercepts, July 1942. These records suggest the Kriegsmarine believed elements of the convoy had been redirected under a special Anglo-Soviet agreement. Yet no such agreement exists in any Allied files available today. Theories abound. But fragments from German naval intelligence hint at something darker. One entry in Kriegsmarine War Diary, dated 7th July 1942, states, 20 merchantmen missing, presumed diverted to undisclosed location. Operation Eisenwolf possibly engaged. Operation Eisenwolf, referenced nowhere else in German archives, appears to have been a code name for a clandestine operation involving both the Kriegsmarine and possibly neutral Scandinavian waters. The total erasure of its records suggests deliberate suppression after the war. Weather reports of the region confirm dense fog banks and strong magnetic anomalies affecting compass navigation, but these alone cannot explain the disappearance of entire convoys without trace. What did remain were recurring reports of phantom vessels, sighted in the same area throughout 1942 and 1943. Ships flying Allied ensigns, yet never answering signals, appearing briefly before fading back into the Arctic mists. Some Soviet trawlers logged these encounters years later, noting hull markings inconsistent with any registered Allied fleet. Intelligence silence surrounding PQ-17's vanishing ships persisted into the Cold War. In 1956, the CIA requested access to Soviet naval archives concerning inconsistencies in Lend-Lease convoy tonnage. Declassified CIA Memorandum SR-12-411 records that Moscow refused, citing irretrievable losses. British files remained redacted until the early 2000s, but even then, details of PQ-17's missing ships were absent. Survivors who raised the issue were frequently discredited or ignored, their recollections filed under non-substantiated claims. One particularly chilling fragment emerges from the diary of Rear Admiral Lewis Hamilton, commander of the escort group. In his private notes, recovered from the Admiralty archives, he wrote on 9th July 1942, "Our orders are silence. Losses not as reported. I fear truth shall never surface." These words, handwritten and never intended for publication, suggest a deeper knowledge of the fate of the missing ships. Hamilton died in 1957, his diaries sealed until the 1980s, when fragments leaked through a historian's request. Even then, critical entries remained censored. What remains undeniable is the absence of evidence. No wrecks of the missing PQ-17 vessels have ever been discovered, despite decades of sonar surveys in the Barents Sea. Modern expeditions have located many of the documented losses, ships sunk by U-boats or Luftwaffe bombers, but the 20 dispersed vessels remain absent from the seabed. It is as if they simply sailed into nothingness, removed from both the ocean and the historical record. The question of their cargo deepens the mystery. Among the declared manifests were crated aircraft, tanks, ammunition, and in several cases, containers marked as restricted experimental supplies. These were destined for Soviet research units in Murmansk. If the ships carrying such materials were redirected, voluntarily or otherwise, it raises the possibility that both Allies and Soviets conspired to conceal sensitive transfers beyond the reach of German intelligence. Yet the abrupt disappearance, coupled with survivor accounts of false escorts, suggests coercion rather than coordination. By 1972, a KGB report labeled Case Frost 17 analyzed the convoy's disappearance in connection with missing Soviet scientists believed to have defected during the war. It theorized that the ships may have been seized to facilitate covert exchanges. Scientists, materials, or even political prisoners moved under the guise of convoy losses. No definitive proof was provided, and the file was marked closed in 1975. Western intelligence never acknowledged the existence of Case Frost 17. Today, the vanishing convoy of Murmansk remains one of the most haunting enigmas of the Second World War. History books recall PQ-17 as a disaster of admiralty miscalculation, but beneath the surface lies the spectre of something more deliberate. 20 ships, hundreds of men, and cargoes marked restricted simply erased from record, denied by both sides of the war. And yet, scattered testimonies, fragmentary documents, and missing tonnage figures point toward a cover-up designed not to shield mistakes, but to bury the truth of an operation so sensitive, so dangerous that silence was deemed safer than disclosure. The frozen Barents still holds its secrets, and in its icy depths, the vanished convoy remains beyond reach, preserved not as wreckage, but as a question history refuses to answer. Chapter 2: Operation Harbinger and the Lost Airfield. In the final months of 1944, as the Third Reich faced collapse on both fronts, Fragments of intelligence began to surface, pointing to a mysterious evacuation program deep within the Bavarian Alps. Codenamed Operation Harbinger, this project appeared nowhere in official Wehrmacht records, yet scattered documents within the captured files of the SS Economic and Administrative Main Office refer cryptically to extraction corridors and air bridges for designated personnel. For decades, historians dismissed these as bureaucratic exaggerations, but newly declassified OSS memoranda from late 1945, filed under Berlin Document Center Reference 12447, speak of a sealed plateau airstrip near Oberammergau, Bavaria, a location that does not appear on any Luftwaffe construction maps, nor in Allied aerial reconnaissance photographs. The mystery lies not in its construction, but in its erasure. According to testimony from captured Luftwaffe engineer Hans-Georg Kessler, Operation Harbinger involved the preparation of a hidden runway, camouflaged by forest and accessible only through a winding mountain pass. He claimed the site was designed to accommodate jet prototypes, including the Messerschmitt Me 262 and the Arado R234, as well as larger transports, fitted to carry sensitive cargo. Under interrogation in Nuremberg, Kessler described nights of frantic labor, followed by the arrival of SS convoys bearing sealed crates and select personnel. These statements were deemed unreliable at trial, yet correlate with unexplained OSS reports of jet propulsion components missing from Augsburg factories. Even more troubling, Soviet intelligence, in a classified NKVD bulletin dated March 1946, noted the sudden disappearance of several high-ranking SS scientists and engineers known to be linked to Germany's experimental weapons programs. American divisions advancing into Bavaria in April 1945 reported unusual civilian accounts. Villagers near Oberammergau recalled weeks of nocturnal flights, their engines screaming through alpine valleys, before the sudden silence of early May. One local priest, Father Ernst Bauer, wrote in his diary, "The mountains roared every night, then one evening nothing. By morning, the valley was scorched earth." Indeed, when engineers from the US 45th Infantry Division entered the suspected valley, they found signs of large-scale demolition, earth torn apart by explosives, foundations scorched, and metal debris hastily buried. Yet no intact aircraft, fuel reserves, or documentation were recovered. The site had been wiped clean, as if deliberately erased. The official report filed by Colonel William Kelso was classified and stamped with the warning, "Do not distribute outside G2." Cross-referencing German records reveals further anomalies. Luftwaffe archives contain scattered references to Flugplatz X9, believed to be a codename for the Oberammergau strip. Entries abruptly cease in January 1945, with the final notation, "Readiness achieved, relocation imminent." After this date, silence. Post-war Allied attempts to locate the airfield using aerial photographs were confounded by the absence of any visible construction. The plateau appeared untouched, the forests dense and unbroken, as if the facility had never existed. Soviet researchers, however, uncovered tantalizing fragments. In 1961, the KGB released an internal assessment titled Operation Harbinger, Unresolved, referencing captured testimony from SS officer Karl-Heinz Riedel. He described the final evacuation flights as not bound for Berlin, but beyond Europe. The ambiguity of this phrase has fueled speculation for decades. Was the airfield used to ferry personnel to neutral territory, such as Spain or South America, or perhaps to secret installations elsewhere in occupied Europe? Or did it serve as a conduit for technology transfers that would later appear in Soviet and American jet programs during the Cold War? Adding to the puzzle, Allied counterintelligence in 1947 intercepted correspondence between former SS officers in Argentina, where one letter makes cryptic mention of Harbinger transports, all accounted for. No physical evidence was provided, yet by the 1950s, several engineers once associated with the Luftwaffe's jet program had resurfaced in South America under false identities. Their presence raises the question, were they passengers on the flights that departed Oberammergau? The enigma deepens with the absence of paper trails. German bureaucracy was renowned for its meticulous record-keeping, yet no requisition orders, construction blueprints, or flight logs have ever been recovered for Harbinger. Even the Reichsluftfahrtministerium (RLM) archives, which detail hundreds of temporary airstrips, contain no references. This silence suggests a project deliberately compartmentalized under the SS, bypassing standard Luftwaffe administration. The involvement of SS Obergruppenführer Hans Kammler, who oversaw secret weapons programs, is strongly suspected. Kammler himself vanished in May 1945, his fate never conclusively proven. If he boarded a Harbinger flight, it may explain why his trail disappears at the very moment of Germany's defeat. In the aftermath of the war, Operation Harbinger was gradually buried beneath layers of Cold War secrecy. OSS files transferred to the newly formed CIA were heavily redacted, while Soviet references to the airfield were confined to internal memoranda. Publicly, historians were left with nothing but rumors of a ghost runway in the Bavarian Alps. By the 1980s, amateur researchers scoured the Oberammergau valleys, uncovering scattered fragments of concrete and rusted metal beneath forest soil, but nothing resembling a functional airstrip. Satellite surveys conducted in the 1990s likewise revealed no conclusive evidence, though anomalies in the terrain suggest large-scale earthworks once existed. The missing link lies in the testimony of Allied pilots who flew reconnaissance over southern Germany in April 1945. One pilot, Lieutenant Robert Sampson, later claimed that his squadron observed a camouflaged landing strip, heavily guarded, with unusual aircraft parked on the edge. His report was filed but quickly classified. Sampson, interviewed decades later, insisted he had not misremembered. "It was there, we saw it. Then days later, it was gone. Someone buried it." His words echo the accounts of villagers who described convoys of trucks departing the valley in the dead of night, their cargo covered in tarpaulin, guarded by armed SS troops. Despite decades of denial, fragments continue to surface. In 2009, researchers gained access to a partially declassified CIA file labeled Harbinger Inquiry. Within it lay a single page, referencing successful extractions via Oberammergau Corridor, May 1945. No further context was provided. The page ended with the statement, "Subject closed. Do not pursue." The implications of Operation Harbinger remain staggering. If the airfield existed, if flights departed under cover of night, then the question is not merely where they went, but what they carried. High-ranking SS officials, engineers, weapons prototypes, perhaps even documents detailing projects never revealed to history. The silence of both Allied and Soviet archives suggests an unspoken agreement that whatever truth lay behind Harbinger was deemed too destabilizing to acknowledge. In this absence of evidence, the lost airfield stands as one of the war's most carefully buried enigmas, a runway that existed only long enough to vanish, leaving behind scorched earth and unanswered questions. Chapter 3: Churchill's Abandoned Convoy Betrayal. In June of 1942, the Arctic Ocean became the setting of one of the most haunting betrayals of the Second World War. Known to historians as Convoy PQ-17, this flotilla of merchant ships carried tanks, aircraft, fuel, ammunition, and essential supplies from Iceland to the Soviet port of Arkhangelsk. But hidden within the archives of the British Admiralty, under cipher designations such as Naval Document 91B, lies evidence that the disaster which befell this convoy was not merely a tragic miscalculation. Instead, it reveals a chilling decision taken at the highest levels of Britain's war command. On July 4, 1942, while the convoy was en route through the icy waters of the Barents Sea, orders arrived from London instructing the escorting warships to withdraw. The merchant vessels, stripped of their defences, were commanded to scatter. The justification was the supposed threat of the German battleship Tirpitz, lurking in Norwegian fjords. But declassified files, smuggled diaries, and intercepted German communications suggest that the decision was made not only out of fear of the Tirpitz, but to safeguard Britain's most valuable secret, the Allied ability to intercept and decode German Enigma transmissions. In the calculus of war, the convoy was abandoned to its fate, sacrificed for intelligence that Churchill believed was worth more than men or material. The disaster unfolded with brutal precision. Once the escorts withdrew, the convoy became easy prey for the Luftwaffe and the Kriegsmarine's U-boat wolf packs. German dive bombers launched from airfields in northern Norway descended in waves, dropping bombs that turned tankers into infernos. Submarines stalked the scattered vessels, their torpedoes striking one after another in the icy waters. Survivors' testimonies, later suppressed by MI5, describe flames spreading across the oil-slick surface, the night sky glowing red as ships erupted into fire. Men who leapt into the water found themselves trapped in freezing seas, their cries fading into silence within minutes. One diary, confiscated from a sailor who survived the sinking of the SS Paulus Potter, recorded, The sky was filled with fire. I heard men screaming for their mothers as the sea swallowed them. The order to scatter was not just death, it was betrayal. The diary was filed under restricted, do not circulate, its contents, deemed too damaging to morale and to Britain's reputation among its allies. Soviet archives corroborate the scale of the catastrophe. Reports sent to Moscow detail that of the 35 merchant ships that set out, 24 were lost. Entire cargoes of tanks, ammunition, and food, desperately needed by Soviet forces fighting the Wehrmacht at Stalingrad, sank beneath the waves. Stalin, furious, accused Churchill of treachery. Cables marked Kremlin File 8112A reveal heated exchanges between Soviet and British leaders, with Stalin demanding answers for the apparent abandonment. Churchill, in his memoirs, would later frame the decision as a defensive measure against the Tirpitz. But German naval logs show that Tirpitz never sailed. The threat was phantom, yet it justified an order that condemned thousands of sailors to death and crippled Soviet trust in its allies for years to come. The Admiralty files reveal layers of secrecy. Naval cipher room transcripts, partially declassified in 1978, show that British intelligence had already intercepted German communications suggesting Tirpitz was not preparing to attack, yet the order to scatter was issued anyway. Historians who gained access to fragments of Document 91B argue that the true motive was fear that if Tirpitz engaged and sunk Allied escorts, the Germans might suspect that their naval codes had been broken. Protecting the secret of Ultra, the Allied decoding of Enigma messages, was judged more important than protecting the convoy. The result was calculated silence. Official communiqué described the disaster as the unfortunate consequence of enemy superiority, omitting the fact that the convoy was deliberately left defenseless. Personal accounts from survivors deepen the sense of betrayal. Letters seized by MI5, written by merchant seamen to their families, speak of their despair at being ordered to scatter. One sailor from the SS Empire Byron wrote, "We were lambs sent into the slaughterhouse. The escorts steamed away and left us to burn. I have no faith left in those who command us." These letters never reached their recipients. Instead, they were stored in secure files, marked as sensitive to public morale. Many survivors who returned were pressured into silence, told that speaking of their ordeal could be considered a breach of the Official Secrets Act. Their trauma became invisible, hidden behind patriotic narratives of unity and sacrifice. The consequences of the betrayal were not limited to lives lost. The Soviets, already suspicious of Western intentions, used the PQ-17 disaster as proof that Britain was unwilling to shoulder equal burdens in the war. NKVD files reveal that Soviet propagandists circulated stories of the convoy's abandonment among Red Army troops, stoking distrust of the Allies. Though Churchill continued to send aid, the shadow of PQ-17 lingered, deepening the fissures that would later define the Cold War. Soviet interrogators during the Nuremberg trials even questioned German naval officers about the convoy, seeking confirmation of British duplicity. Yet these inquiries were downplayed in Western records, buried beneath layers of denial. The material loss was staggering. Tanks intended for the defense of Stalingrad never arrived. Ammunition that could have fueled Soviet offensives lay at the bottom of the Arctic. Food that could have sustained soldiers and civilians was gone. The Soviet files note bitterly that the blood of our people will be spilled because of British cowardice. Yet in the Admiralty's internal communications, the disaster was framed in strategic terms. Protecting Ultra, they argued, had saved countless more lives in the long run. The men of PQ-17, their ships, their cargo, their suffering, became nothing more than collateral in the mathematics of war. To this day, questions remain unanswered. The full version of Naval Document 91B has never been released. Large sections remain blacked out, entire paragraphs concealed under national security restrictions. Researchers who have seen fragments describe them as damning, suggesting foreknowledge of the convoy's destruction. Survivors' groups have long demanded full transparency, but successive governments have refused. The truth remains buried under layers of classification, the betrayal acknowledged only in whispers. In the end, PQ-17 was not just a naval disaster. It was a deliberate act of sacrifice, a decision written in cold ink on Admiralty paper, carried out on the backs of ordinary sailors who were left to freeze, burn, and drown in the Arctic night. Churchill's abandoned convoy is remembered today in fragments. Rusting hulls at the bottom of the Barents Sea, survivor testimonies that surface in faded letters and diaries, and archival files with blacked-out lines that hint at truths still untold. It remains one of the most disturbing chapters of the war because it blurs the line between strategy and betrayal. The men of PQ-17 were not defeated by German firepower alone. They were betrayed by their own command, sacrificed in silence to preserve a secret that the public was never meant to know. Chapter 4: The Forbidden Pact of Casablanca. In January 1943, the city of Casablanca became the unlikely stage for one of the most celebrated Allied conferences of the Second World War. Roosevelt, Churchill and de Gaulle convened under the palm trees of Morocco, projecting unity to a war-weary world. Their declarations, demanding the unconditional surrender of the Axis, planning the invasion of Italy, and reaffirming the Allied partnership, were broadcast triumphantly across the globe. Yet behind the speeches and photographs lay a hidden negotiation, documented not in the official minutes, but in a series of intelligence reports later buried in French, American, and British archives. These reports, known within French intelligence as Dossier Indigo, describe a secret pact struck between Roosevelt, Churchill, and selected members of the Free French Command. The pact authorized covert Anglo-American operations against elements of the Free French forces suspected of communist influence, even while Allied leaders publicly celebrated their solidarity. This forbidden agreement, if fully exposed, would have revealed that at the very height of Allied unity, plans were already underway to undermine one another in the shadows. The existence of Dossier Indigo first surfaced in a memorandum drafted by Colonel Jacques Mercier of the French Deuxième Bureau in February 1943. Mercier had attended portions of the conference as an intelligence liaison and claimed to have witnessed an off-record discussion between British and American envoys. His memorandum, later seized by the CIA in 1948, stated plainly, "Agreement has been reached to conduct surveillance, disinformation, and neutralization against Free French brigades where communist loyalties threaten Anglo-American control." The operation was given the codename Project Salamander. This was not military strategy against the Axis, it was political warfare against supposed allies. Evidence of Salamander appears in OSS archives, where partially declassified files describe infiltration of French units stationed in North Africa. Agents were instructed to spread false orders, intercept communications, and redirect supplies to units deemed loyal to Gaullist leadership, but independent from Moscow influence. In one chilling passage, OSS Field Report 1743 notes, "Objectives achieved, mutinous chatter silenced, leaders reassigned to neutral postings." The names of those leaders remain redacted, but oral testimony from veterans of the 9th Colonial Infantry Division describes sudden arrests of officers accused of Bolshevik sympathies, followed by their disappearance into detention centers in Algiers. No official charges were ever recorded. Churchill's own involvement is suggested in fragments of his wartime diaries. In a private note dated 19th of January 1943, later censored before publication, he wrote, "FDR concurs. Unity in public, firmness in private. Salamander shall bite when needed." The diary entry, preserved only in draft form, is one of the few direct links connecting the Casablanca Pact to Allied leadership. Roosevelt's archives offer less clarity, though a letter from OSS Director William Donovan to Roosevelt references contingencies agreed upon in Casablanca, political stabilization of French North Africa. The phrasing is deliberately vague, yet in the context of Dossier Indigo, its meaning becomes unmistakable. The Soviets, too, were not blind. NKVD intercepts of Allied diplomatic traffic in early 1943 include references to fractures within French command. In a March 1943 memorandum, Stalin noted to Molotov, "Roosevelt and Churchill weakened de Gaulle, fearing red contagion." These suspicions fed directly into Stalin's deep mistrust of the West, which only intensified at later conferences in Tehran and Yalta. By burying the existence of the Casablanca Pact, Western governments not only concealed internal betrayal, but also obscured one of the very roots of Cold War division. Testimony from French soldiers who served in North Africa adds human weight to the paper trail. Sergeant Marcel Duval, interviewed in 1957, recalled, "Our captain vanished after Casablanca. We were told he had been reassigned, but we never saw him again. The Americans suddenly had men inside our camp, asking questions, watching us. We were fighting Germans, but they treated us as enemies. His account aligns with others, suggesting Project Salamander was not merely surveillance but active purging of officers considered politically unreliable. The erasure of Salamander was swift. By 1948, when the CIA absorbed OSS files, Dossier Indigo was classified as high sensitivity, do not circulate. French intelligence denied its existence, and when de Gaulle returned to power after the war, he never spoke publicly of the Pact. Some historians suggest he was aware, but chose silence to preserve national unity and Franco-American relations during the Cold War. Churchill's diaries, heavily edited before publication, omitted every reference to Salamander, while Roosevelt's archives remained sealed under the justification of executive privilege. Yet traces persisted. In 1976, a British journalist named Alan Robson uncovered fragments of Salamander files while researching OSS operations. His subsequent article, The Hidden War in Casablanca, alleged that the Allies sabotaged their own French partners. Within weeks of publication, Robson was discredited in the press, and his sources retracted their statements. The article disappeared from circulation, surviving only in private collections. FOIA requests filed in the United States throughout the 1980s for Project Salamander yielded heavily redacted documents, some pages entirely black. The existence of Dossier Indigo has never been officially acknowledged by Paris, London, or Washington. The Forbidden Pact of Casablanca reveals an unsettling truth. Even as the Allies fought shoulder to shoulder against Hitler, they sowed seeds of distrust among themselves. The war within the war, silent, political, and treacherous, was not fought against the Axis, but within the fragile alliance itself. If revealed at the time, it would have exposed that Allied unity was a carefully crafted illusion, maintained for public morale, while, in private, leaders plotted against their own partners. The enduring silence surrounding Project Salamander is not simply about protecting wartime reputations. It is about burying the uncomfortable reality that victory was pursued not only against the Reich, but also against one another. And in Casablanca, beneath the glow of cameras and speeches of unity, that betrayal was sealed in secrecy. The stories you have just heard leave us with more questions than answers. A reminder that the archives of the Second World War remain littered with silences that speak louder than words. Convoy PQ-17's missing ships never surfaced, their cargoes and men swallowed not by the sea, but by the veil of secrecy that erased them from every ledger. Operation Harbinger's lost airfield rose and fell in the Bavarian Alps, yet the earth itself was altered to deny its existence. The Katyn forest, already synonymous with mass murder, may conceal victims whose names were rewritten, their deaths buried in a ledger Moscow still denies ever existed. And Casablanca, remembered as a symbol of Allied unity, now carries the shadow of betrayal, an unspoken pact that fractured trust long before the Cold War began. These fragments of truth, scattered across declassified pages, survivor testimonies, and censored diaries, hint at a history deliberately rewritten. Why did so many governments, Allied and Axis alike, choose silence over disclosure? Were these erasures acts of necessity, or calculated manipulations to protect power? Perhaps the answers lie still sealed in vaults, where yellowing papers are marked not to be released. Or perhaps the answers were destroyed decades ago, leaving only rumors, half-truths, and the whispers of those who remember. What remains is the haunting knowledge that the war's greatest secrets were not always fought on battlefields, but in the shadows where files vanished, witnesses disappeared, and history itself was reshaped. The question we must ask is simple and terrifying. How many more forbidden stories remain buried, waiting to be unearthed?